From PBS News Student Reporting Labs
and WETA,
this is On Our Minds
with Evelyn
and Eason,
a podcast made by teens for teens,
telling stories about who inspires us. I really like that last episode that we just did about family. It honestly makes me appreciate family so much more.
Yeah, I agree. In today's episode, we'll dive deeper into culture and identity. We have a special conversation to share with you with an author. His name is Viet Thanh Nguyen. He is a Vietnamese-American novelist.
But before we go into that conversation, we first want to share with you one more story about family. This one comes from Annalise, who's from Danville, California. She and her dad talk about their culture and identity.
When my dad is traveling, we like to stay updated by FaceTiming, so let's give him a call. Hola, papi. ¿Estás listo?
Sí, hija, comencemos.
Pause really quickly. My dad's Chinese, and I'm half Chinese, half Vietnamese, so why are we speaking Spanish to each other? Even though my dad was born in China, he moved to Ecuador when he was 5, and he lived in the South American country until he moved to the US at 16. Ecuador is a huge part of his culture and identity, and because we speak Spanish together at home, now it's a part of mine. But don't just take my word for it. As the only Chinese family in your Ecuadorian town, what was it like for you growing up?
I can definitely tell you that it wasn't easy. It's just a big part of human nature to want to fit in, and when you look differently and speak differently than the people around you, it's really difficult.
Is there any particular moments you can recall, whether it was in Ecuador or America, where you felt like you were treated differently because of how you looked?
I think a lot of the times people will see that I'm a Chinese man, and so they'll try to say ni hao to me or something like that. I know that it is impossible to ask for someone to know that I'm from Ecuador because I do look Asian. But I do think that in America, because we are so diverse, it's kind of odd to me that people would still say ni hao and assume that I'm Chinese and speak Chinese. And so my go-to response to kind of deflect that kind of stereotyping is I just talk in really rapid-fire Spanish, and I think it just catches them off guard. It's kind, it's not aggressively calling them out, but at the same time, I hope that message really sticks with them. And people know that going into the future, you can't always assume someone's race or ethnicity just because of how they look. And oftentimes, you'll find that a lot of people's backgrounds and histories are a lot more complex than you would initially think. And I think that's really beautiful.
I love the way you put that, Papi. Now that you've been in America for so long, what are some aspects of your Ecuadorian culture that you still keep with you? And how have you managed to keep them alive?
Well, it really comes in the little things like listening to Spanish music, being sure to speak with you and your brother in Spanish as much as I can. And, sometimes cooking Ecuadorian dishes for dinner, they're just little ways that I can preserve my culture and really maintain my identity.
Yes, heavy on the dishes. My favorite that you make is encebollado, which is a fish stew that's topped with onions.
That used to be my favorite dish back in Ecuador, too. And so I love being able to keep that tradition alive and pass it down through the generations. And I hope really one day when you have kids, you make it for them, too.
Do you ever feel kind of lost balancing all these different aspects of your identity? Like you have traditions from America and China and Ecuador. How do you keep it all straight?
I'd say it's a lot harder sounding than it really is. I mean, for me, all these cultures and traditions are just part of my identity. And so when I just show up every day, it feels like I'm really representing all these aspects of my heritage. For example, maybe I'm celebrating Chinese New Year with my parents, but I'm also speaking English because I'm in America, and I'm listening to my Spanish music with you in the car ride home from school. The real difficulty is in how I define myself. I sometimes struggle with feeling like I belong to one culture or another, but I don't think I have much of a problem representing it all in my everyday life because they're just such an integral part of me. And I think I really show it every day with everything I do.
I can definitely see what you're saying because, as your daughter, when I think of you, I just think, hey, that's Papi, that's Dad, he just does what he does. And if it's all part of your identity, then every single day when you show up just as yourself, you really are showing everything that you came from and every culture that you represent. What advice do you have for other people about preserving their traditions and really feeling proud of their identity?
Ooh, that's a tough one. What I would say to that is really to use your loved ones, really share what you know and what you love with the people in your life. For example, I've sourced so much pride and joy and love from sharing my traditions and my cultures and all my silly stories about my life back in Ecuador with you and your brother. And to never forget that part of yourself and to always hold it close to your heart, you should be introducing it to other people that you care about. And that's really how you become proud of it, because I promise you, as you share your culture, other people find it interesting. Other people find it amazing and beautiful and special to see so many people experiencing so many different things. And so really just share what you know and love and who you are and show what makes you unique.
Hey Dad, can we go out singing Rosas by La Oreja de Van Gogh?
Por eso esperaba con la carita papada que llegaras con rosas para mí. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah, I found it hilarious that her dad rapid fires Spanish as a way to combat stereotypes.
Yeah. I know how he says he doesn't find it hard to keep in touch with his culture, but honestly, sometimes I kind of feel like I'm losing touch with my Chinese side.
Yeah, I didn't really realize that this was an issue until people started mentioning this idea of like losing your identity and culture. And I was like, whoa, should I be worried? I'm kind of like, my biggest concern is like not being able to talk with native people in China.
I think I'll always be able to talk in Chinese just fine, but it's, the surface level Chinese versus like Chinese
Textbook.
culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I can always have like a businessy conversation, but to, get all the memes in China, like make references, talking like Chinese slang, that's like a whole different level that like, honestly, whenever I try to talk with my cousin over text, I'm like, should I be making some kind of like reference to this? Like, is there a meme that I can reference that makes it not so stiff? But yeah, that's one of my concerns.
I'm glad this is a universal experience. Universal insecurity.
Actually, these are some issues that our author today writes about. Viet Thanh Nguyen is a writer, scholar, and activist. His best-selling novel, The Sympathizer, won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2016. He also has published short stories, children's books, and his memoir.
Student reporter Khadeejah Khan spoke with Mr. Nguyen last fall.
Hi, Mr. Nguyen. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
I want to start off by saying how much you inspire me, especially by how you tell the story of the Vietnam War. Beyond your writing, your activism and advocacy has sparked so much solidarity between so many communities and has definitely spoken to me as a Muslim South Asian American writer. I'm curious, who are some of your literary inspirations?
I think that when I was growing up as a refugee in California, I just went to the public library and I read everything. I was reading Charles Dickens and William Thackeray and a lot of English literature and boys' literature, children's literature that were basically all written by white people. And they were probably not thinking that they were writing to a young Vietnamese refugee boy or that someone like me one day would be reading their works. And yet I was connecting with those works. And I think for me, the inspirational part of that is knowing, therefore, that out there in the world, there are people who are not like me, who are reading my work as well. And that being said, it's still also great, obviously, when we find writers and works that seem even more specific to our cultural, historical, political experiences. And so when I started reading writers of color, reading writers who were actively engaged in decolonization and activism, in addition to thinking about themselves as writers who were trying to be great artists as well, that was really inspiring for me because I could see that there were other people kind of like me who had already done this work that seemed so daunting.
And in your writing, you describe this idea of being a spy and a man of two faces, which is also the title of your memoir. Growing up, for me, Muslim and American, I was made to believe as if my identities could never intersect, that one was always against the other. And when I read your work, I was reminded how in my community, after 9/11, the disconnect between our identities were used by organizations like NYPD, who hired Muslim Americans as informants or spies against other Muslim Americans post 9/11. Could you tell me a bit more about your relationship between your identities and how you bridge them throughout your life?
The fact that some of us may feel internal conflicts around who we are is obviously very important, but I think it's also indicative of what you just pointed out, which is that there is no community out there, probably, that is unified. You could call a community Muslim American or South Asian or Vietnamese American or what have you, but that is simply to put a label on a very heterogeneous group of people. So the outside world might look at Vietnamese Americans and think, well, they're Vietnamese American. That label says everything. But inside the Vietnamese American community, we may love each other and so on, but we also may hate each other too. And that's just a very human response. And that's why we have civil wars and revolutions and things like that you're undoubtedly very familiar with. And that's certainly exactly what we're witnessing now, that we don't have a unified Asian American community. We don't have a unified American nation. That's deeply uncomfortable for a lot of us. And if we want to try to ameliorate those conditions, I think our task as writers is certainly to struggle with not trying to offer solutions necessarily, but to struggle with that very human nature that produces those kinds of fractures. And I think for me, that's what a novel like The Sympathizer does. I don't know if anybody should turn to the Sympathizer, for example, to make themselves feel better about an identity, but hopefully they'll feel better about the fact that other people have struggled with these same kinds of issues. And I think that's one of the things that art and writing can offer us, is a deep grappling with human complexity. And if that human complexity on the surface looks like our human complexity in terms of our faces and colors and religions and so on, that's an added bonus.
And as we talk about themes of identity, and especially in your writing, another theme is memory. Where memory starts, how memory can be painful, but forgetting can also be especially dangerous without accepting and understanding the memory. Today, we live in an America that has made efforts to erase its racist colonial past in education and broader conversations. What are some of the dangers that can come with these efforts?
Oh, I think the dangers are pretty obvious. And the United States is hardly unique. I think every nation probably engages in these deliberate acts of erasure. And that's because we all want to protect an image of ourselves and our communities and our nations that fits a certain ideal. And amnesia and forgetting certainly play a key role in the rewriting of our historical and personal narratives. The danger, obviously, is that by pretending that we have not compromised ourselves, that we have not betrayed our ideals, that we have not killed others in the name of our own self-interest. And I really think that only by recognizing how fundamental to the American character these aspects of genocide, colonization, and enslavement happen to be, only by realizing that they're fundamental rather than accidental, can we actually try to prevent them from being repeated. And unfortunately, I think many Americans are certainly not at that stage, and that's why they would rather forget that these things have happened at all.
And I think the best way of understanding our identity is also by understanding history, and that's where education can come through. And as a college student, you stepped into the world of activism, having been arrested at college protests twice. Now, as a professor at University of Southern California, you've spoken at protests in solidarity with Palestine and Gaza. How do activism and writing intersect for you, especially as an Asian American writer?
I think they've intersected as long as I thought of myself as a writer and as a scholar. When I was a young boy and I wanted to be a writer and I was writing and drawing my own book, certainly I had no conception of what an activist was. I also had no conception of what a writer was, to be honest. So to me, it was all just fun and games. And that's actually at the core of what art should be, I think. I mean, I think for me, like, being an artist or being a writer is fundamentally about being playful. But at a certain point, I also realized that play was extremely serious. That's the paradox and the contradiction for me of being a writer. It's both serious and playful all at the same time. And the topics and the themes that concern me are certainly, I think, universal topics and themes, all the human emotions and all that kind of thing, but also the questions of exploitation and injustice that are also universal as well. So the challenge for me was always, well, how do I create an art that's adequate to dealing with both the personal and the political? And once I started to think in those terms, it was inevitable that I also started to think in activist terms as well. And of course, art and activism are not the same thing. They're different worlds, but they do overlap in very important ways. And I like to think that my work occupies that space where things overlap.
As we talk about resistance and identity and how all of these aspects of ourselves come in our advocacy, a big part of your memoir that stuck with me the most is when you write about the myth of being a voice for the voiceless, as communities that are titled voiceless are instead deliberately silenced, and that instead we should abolish the conditions of voicelessness. What advice do you have for young people like myself who also want to spark this change?
The reason why I think for me that slogan, abolish the conditions of voicelessness, is powerful for me is because it demands that we think about what that would entail. What are the conditions that silence people? They are complex. And in order to abolish those conditions, we need art, we need writing, but we need all these other forms of political engagement and activism as well. If I look back on my genealogy of the writers and activists who have influenced me, they made a difference in their lifetimes. They did move us forward to a certain degree, and that made it possible for me to move forward to a certain degree. So for those of us who believe in art and who believe in abolishing the conditions of voicelessness, we've made a commitment of a lifetime.
I'm glad that we're able to end this conversation in a light of hope and optimism for the next generation of storytellers, writers, readers, or journalists who also want to abolish the conditions of voicelessness. Thank you so much for your time and speaking with me today.
Khadeejah, it was lovely talking to you.
Especially considering the polarization in politics recently, it's super insightful to hear from someone like Mr. Nguyen talk about our struggles with identity versus unity.
Even within our communities, our own communities, we can sometimes feel out of place. And it was so validating to hear what he said. For me personally, I was born in Taiwan and I lived in China for 10 years. And then now I live in the US. So it's a constant struggle to have to balance all three of these identities. And honestly, what Mr. Nguyen said is like speaking something that I haven't been able to form into my own words.
Before we go, we have another podcast we recommend you check out.
Is Charles Bingley from Pride and Prejudice, the king of all himbos?
Does Shakespeare actually write that Hamlet poops his pants?
In the Odyssey, is Penelope's house the original MILF Manor?
Who's the most annoying character in literature, and why is it Tiny Tim?
We answer all these questions and more on Save Me From My Shelf, a comedy podcast by two literature scholars, where we take classic tomes off their pedestal to make you less anxious about reading them.
Whether you need help for school, always meant to read some big classics but never got around to it, or if you simply want to see Robinson Crusoe thrown in the gutter where he belongs, we're here to provide.
Every episode we give you some background on a famous work, recap the plot with plenty of jokes, and then analyze it.
And this season we're covering banned books. Madame Bovary, The Handmaid's Tale, The Kite Runner, Ulysses, and more. If it's controversial, we want to talk about it.
Listen to Save Me From My Shelf, wherever you get your podcasts.
Today's segments were produced by Annalise and Khadeejah.
Lead podcast producer Briget Ganske produced this episode with editing and mixing by Genesis Magpayo and help from Wyatt Mayes.
Ryan James is our audio and camera operator.
Approval and oversight by editorial director Marie Cusick and executive producer Leah Clapman.
Theme music by Isaiah Brown. Additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Are we done for today? Is that all we're doing? Okay.
Huh?
I will.
turn around and you're just doing that.
I've been practicing it.
Okay.
That was such a bad clap.
Weak clap.
There we go.
Okay.
Or you should just do a sound bite where it's like you go into the mic. Stereotypes. How we put it.